Hey y'all, I'm James Wright and welcome to my shop. Today we're going to be talking dovetails. This is a topic that really scares a lot of people, and when you first get into it, the idea of cutting a freehand dovetail is just, it's terrifying to a lot of people. And so one of the options out there is to get a jig. And particularly this is a jig from Cat's Moses Woodworking. This is the old style one with the wood. He sent me one of these that's all poly and really beautiful. So I wanted to do a video today showing some of the differences, compare, contrast between doing it freehand and doing it with a jig. So this should be kind of fun. We're going to do a full set of dovetails freehand, and we're going to do a full set of dovetails with the jig. So it'll be interesting to see which one comes out better and which one is more enjoyable. So let's dive in and take a look at it. So what we have here is a depth cut line, and then on the top we have 90-degree lines running across the board. Now the nice thing about freehand is you can just pick up the saw, go right to your line, and cut it. And I don't care what the angle is because we're cutting tails first. So I'm going to set the angle something around this. And then I can cut right down to my depth line. Doing it without a jig just makes it very fast, very efficient, and fairly simple to cut. And just like that, we've cut all of our tails down. The one problem with them is they might be slightly at different angles, but that's okay, they just look hand cut then. So next, let's show how it's done with a jig. So with the jig, the first thing I want to do is set the saw where I want the cut, and then I'm going to put the jig right up against it and start my cut there. Now the nice thing is I just have to hold this jig in place, and the magnets will keep the saw in place, and I don't have to think about it. I just have to go down to the correct depth cut. And then second verse, same as the first. Just set it on the line, put the jig up against it, and cut down to your mark. It goes fairly quickly, and you're assured all your angles are precisely the same. So now I've been cutting on this side. The problem is when I flip around to do the other tails, now my jig is on the other side, and I have to switch hands and cut left-handed. Otherwise, I can try and hold this down underneath and keep the saw in place. Just kind of a bit janky. So that's why usually I try to be ambidextrous and cut with the other hand. Just a good skill to know. And just like that, we are down to depth. And I don't have to worry about it as much because if my hand moves a little bit, that's okay. The magnets do a really good job of holding the plate exactly where it needs to be. So now we need to remove the material in between the tails. But on the outside, you can also use the jig to cut at 90 degrees across. Let me show you that. So freehand, if you see a line, you can cut to it. But sometimes that just requires a bit more skill. And even then, you're going to want to stay away from the line a little bit and then come in and clean it up with a chisel. So just like on the other side, when we need to cut across here, rather than just doing it freehand, this jig actually has a 90-degree plate, so I can put it on there. So I can set the saw exactly where I want it, and then rotate the head until the magnets match up, and now I know it's cutting at 90 degrees. And if you cut directly on it, then you won't need to clean up much other than that little bit that's in the corner. So for the tail in between, I could come in with a coping saw and clean that out, or I can come in with a chisel, the way I generally prefer. Unfortunately, the jig won't help you cleaning out there in the middle, so you're still probably going to have to clean it up with a chisel even if you come in with a coping saw. I just prefer to do it by hand and chop it out with a chisel. So once we've chopped this out, the big major difference is we can use this as a chiseling guide. So I can put the chisel right into that marking gauge line, and then I can slide this up against it and use it as a square to reference the cut down. Pinch it down on there, a couple quick taps, and I know my chisel is going down perfectly square. And just like that, a really nice clean shoulder all the way down. The only other thing we have to do is get into these tight corners and clean them out. So now we have our freehand cut tails and our jig cut tails. The next thing we have to do is start cutting the pins that go between them, and that's kind of where the magic comes in. Now with the freehand tails, you have to transfer the marks from this directly onto the plate, and so that means very, very carefully drawing out your lines where they meet. Do not bump the board or you're going to have to start all over again. So the other thing you have to be careful with freehand cutting is make sure your cut is perfectly vertical up and down. So you want to come back in and add in these lines that will help guide your eye while you're cutting. Now that we have all the lines laid out, we can come in, just like any other cut, follow the line down, and hopefully these tails will fit precisely. The only thing you want to be careful of is make sure you cut on the correct side of the line. Nothing will ruin your tails as much as cutting on the wrong side of the line. So with the dovetail jig, it becomes a little bit easier because you don't have to have a solid line to follow, you just have to have a line to sit on. So you can actually just put a mark and let the jig do the rest. You don't have to hold it quite as perfect, but it still helps to do that. The thing with the jig is this is a 6-to-1 ratio, so when you're cutting the tails, it puts it at a 6-to-1 angle this way, and when you're cutting the pins, it puts it at a 6-to-1 ratio in the opposite direction. So you can just set the jig to the appropriate side, put your plate right on that line, slide the jig up against it, and then let the jig do the work. Let the jig keep the saw at vertical. So I don't have to draw a line down the side. I just have to stop at my depth stop. The nice thing about cutting this side is there's two sides to the angle, so I can just rotate it 90 degrees and I can still use my right hand on the saw. No reason to become ambidextrous. I do still have to be careful that I cut on the right side of the line because, well, you know what happens when you cut on the wrong side. Just like with the tails, we have to clean out the pins in between. So you can come in with a coping saw and remove most of the waste, or you can chisel it out, your choice. And then with the jig, you can still use this as a chiseling guide to keep it at 90 degrees and chop straight down on your marking gauge line. This is the hand cut one. We can see how well it comes to right off the saw. So it's just cleaning it up. And I can tell right here, it's already jamming up. And I've got a bit of a problem back in this corner. So we've got to fix this up. And it's rare to have a hand cut joint that doesn't need a little bit of work right off the saw. So I'm going to come in and clean this up and see how it fits here in a moment. Okay, so now I had to clean up a little bit on the inside of the pins, and we can see how this then fits down in. Just like that. Really nice clean joint. Once you glue that up and plane these down, that's going to look like butter. And we can see it's nice and square the way we want it. So this is the Cat's Moses dovetail jig side. And we can see this is straight off of the saw. I haven't done any cleanup on this. And I get that really nice clean joint. I have a little bit of a gap on this one, but I think that's because I slid over. Well, it is because I slid over. So it's not quite where it needs to be. But let's take a look at these. So you can really never completely test a dovetail until you can glue it up and plane it down nice and flush, and that will show up some things. But you can see most of the gaps right now. This one on the bottom is from the dovetail jig, and there's a bit of a gap here, but the gap is perfectly parallel on this side and this side, so that means that it was my fault that the saw moved over. But other than that, the other three lines are really nice and tight. On this one up here that was hand cut, this one is tight, this one is tight. This one there's a bit of gap up here in the corner, but it's nice and tight on this side. This one there's a little bit of gap here, but it's nice and tight on this side. So you can tell my saw was out of skew, making a little bit of a gap here and a little bit of a gap here. So I guess it depends to you whether or not you want it to be because your hand is out of skew or because you made a mistake putting the saw in the wrong place. If you take your time, that wouldn't be a problem at all using a jig. So there you have it, dovetails done by hand, whether or not to use a jig or to do it freehand. There's really nothing wrong with using a jig. As a matter of fact, it makes it very easy. If you haven't done dovetails before, this will teach you how to do dovetails because you still have to hold the saw, you still have to run the saw. This just makes it a little bit easier to get a nice clean joint. And if you were to compare these two right off the bat, you would not be able to tell which one was hand cut without a jig and which one was hand cut with a jig. They're both really nice, clean dovetails. The difference is, without the jig, you've got to have a lot of experience and you've got to spend some time learning how to do it. Without the jig, anyone can pick it up and get a fairly decent dovetail right off. And if you get used to using the jig, you can make them really nice. And if you go to Cat's Moses' website, you can actually see what some of his things are, where he does inlaid dovetails with this. It's really an easy way to get good results without spending the years of practice to get good results with just using your hand on a saw. So, is there anything wrong with this? No. Do I use it? No, but that's because I've spent the time and I can do it by hand and get relatively good results. If I was starting off, I probably would want to get one of these. They're extremely useful. Now that being said, there are many different types of dovetail jigs. There's one by Veritas that makes a great one. The problem with that one is the head of it is a little bit too tall, so most Western saws, there isn't enough space between the saw and the back, so you can't get a full 3/4 inch cut. Use a Japanese saw and you can get that. Whereas these ones from Cat Moses are a little bit shorter, so even with a thin plate like this, I can still get a full 3/4 inch cut and get a nice dovetail with a back saw. I will leave a link to these down below in the description. It is probably one of the only jigs I have in my shop for guiding a saw, and it's one that I do like. Anytime I don't want to take the chance of problems with a freehand cut, this is the jig I'm going to grab. So it's well worth the time and money, and one that I would heartily recommend. So which is better, freehand or jig? It really doesn't matter that much. They both can turn out great quality things. The question is whether or not you want the challenge to be in your hand, or if you want to turn out dovetails regularly and with decent precision, grab yourself a jig. So I hope you like that. I've been looking forward to showing this off for a while and showing some of the differences between freehand and using a jig. I don't have any problem with them. I really like them. I just don't use them as much in my shop. So I hope you've liked the information. I do want to say a huge thank you to those of you on Patreon and those of you who've purchased shirts and card scrapers. That really does help out the channel. I don't have any sponsors on this channel, so what I want to say is what I want to say, not what someone else is telling me to say. So I hope you like that. That's about it for today. Until next time, have a wonderful day. Okay, everyone. This is a dovetail jig, and this is a dovetail jig.